This case just took a shocking turn that nobody saw coming, as a judge drops a bombshell ruling that slams the brakes on subpoenas and sends panic through powerful circles behind the scenes. Private messages, legal strategies, and reputations are now hanging by a thread. And what happens next could change everything. The story opens quietly, almost deceptively calm, with Blake positioned as the reassuring presence. The person telling everyone to relax, that nothing is wrong, that everything is under control, and that framing matters because it lulls the audience into a sense of safety before the floor drops out from underneath the narrative. Because while the public was told repeatedly that marketing, publicity, and promotion decisions were handled by others, that Blake was simply following an approved plan, a document sitting on the public docket tells a radically different story, and that document is not speculation, it is a formal letter Blake herself submitted to the Producers Guild in pursuit of professional credit, and within that letter she does not describe herself as a participant. She describes herself as the central authority. She presents herself as the architect of the marketing strategy, the overseer of content creation, the coordinator of cast participation, and the driving force behind publicity logistics alongside her husband and their production company. And once you understand what that letter actually represents, the entire case reframes itself, because the Producers Guild submission is not a diary entry, it is a sworn professional account designed to establish leadership, control, and responsibility. And when someone claims those things in writing, they are not incidental. They are intentional, and that is why this letter became so dangerous to keep public, because it contradicts the version of events later presented elsewhere, where Blake is framed as an employee without authority, and those two positions cannot coexist. And that contradiction becomes the engine driving everything that follows as you move deeper into the letter. The scope of what Blake claims expands dramatically, because she does not limit herself to marketing. She asserts involvement in pre-production, post-production, editing, test screenings, audience feedback, international distribution, sponsor outreach, premiere, logistics, and press coordination. And each claim builds on the last, creating a portrait not of an actress following instructions, but of an executive-level decision-maker. And the suspense grows because the audience realizes that every one of these claims directly undermines later arguments about lack of control. And when Blake writes that she produced content days, coordinated 8 cast members, worked with authors and producers, managed publicity schedules, and secured participation, she is placing herself at the top of the operational hierarchy. And that matters because leadership implies authority, and authority implies accountability. And this is where the narrative tension tightens, because the same individual cannot simultaneously be directing outcomes and disclaiming responsibility for them. And once the viewer grasps that reality, they are locked in, because the question is no longer what happened, but why. To opposing stories were told, the document goes further, claiming responsibility for managing interpersonal dynamics, safety concerns, and even acting as a mediator for cast and crew issues. And while these statements are framed as supportive and protective, their implications are enormous, because human resources, mediation, safety enforcement, and policy oversight are managerial functions. And when someone claims to have handled those roles, it reshapes every allegation that followed. And this is where the suspense intensifies, because the audience begins to see how the narrative was constructed. Depending on the audience, it was delivered to one version emphasizing leadership and initiative for professional recognition, another emphasizing vulnerability and lack of power for legal positioning. And that duality is not subtle, it is structural. And it forces the viewer to reassess everything they thought they understood about who was in charge. Then comes the revelation that this letter was not meant to be widely seen, and that attempts were made to keep it sealed. And that detail alone raises eyebrows, because if the contents supported the public narrative, there would be no reason to hide them, and secrecy breeds suspicion, especially when the claims inside directly conflict with public statements. And as the audience processes this, the stakes rise, because this is no longer about one disagreement on set, it is about credibility and consistency. And once credibility is questioned, everything else becomes unstable. Suspense escalates further when communications behind the scenes begin to surface, showing how narratives were reinforced privately even as they were denied publicly. Because while one side maintained that certain individuals were uninvolved, messages suggest active engagement, lobbying, and influence. And that matters, because influence behind closed doors often shapes outcomes more than official titles. And when spouses, executives, agents, and studio figures are looped into private conversations, framing one individual negatively while promoting another, the audience starts to see a pattern forming, and patterns keep viewers watching because they suggest intent, not accident. What keeps the audience glued at this stage is the slow realization that this was not a spontaneous conflict, but a carefully managed situation where perception control mattered as much as creative control. And as more details stack up, the viewer understands that this is not a story with a clean villain and hero, but a story about power dynamics, reputation management, and the collision between private documentation and public storytelling. And by the end of this section, the viewer is no longer asking whether something feels off. They know it is off, and they want to see how deep it goes, and that unresolved tension is exactly what pulls them into the next chapter, because once you see the contradiction, you cannot unsee it. And once authority is claimed in one forum, it cannot be erased in another, and that is where the story truly begins. Tension deepens when you follow what happened after that Producers Guild letter. Because once authority is claimed on paper, everything that follows starts to look different. And the audience begins to notice how messaging shifts depending on who is listening. Because publicly the story becomes one of distance and separation, while privately communication shows proximity, coordination, and urgency. And this is where the narrative stops being about one project and starts being about influence. Because when people with access to studios, agents, and executives are communicating outside official channels, it creates a shadow layer of decision-making that viewers instinctively recognize as powerful. And the reason this matters is not because of who sent a message, but because of what those messages were designed to accomplish, which was reassurance, alignment, and narrative stabilization. And when you look at the timing, it becomes impossible to ignore that these communications happened at moments when pressure was rising and perception was slipping, and that is how the audience understands. This was not reactive but strategic. As more private exchanges surface, the picture becomes clearer, because while public statements emphasized non-involvement, private language emphasized protection, advocacy, and intervention. And that contradiction pulls viewers deeper, because it reveals a split between what was said on record and what was done behind the scenes. And when someone describes themselves as having no role, while simultaneously advocating, influencing, and coordinating outcomes, it raises questions that cannot be brushed aside. And this is where the suspense locks in, because the audience realizes they are watching two parallel stories unfold, one visible, one hidden, and the hidden one is only visible through fragments, text, filings, and testimony. And each fragment adds weight to the idea that this was a managed narrative, not an organic dispute. The plot thickens when industry reactions are introduced, because internal commentary from studio leadership begins to acknowledge frustration, not with outside forces but with internal decisions. And that is a critical turning point, because it shows that backlash was being analyzed as self-generated rather than externally imposed. And when executives privately describe choices as unsavvy or damaging, it reframes the entire situation, because it suggests that the negative response was foreseeable, avoidable, and internally driven. And that insight keeps viewers watching, because it contradicts the idea of an uncontrollable media storm and instead paints a picture of preventable fallout. And once that door opens, the audience wants to know who ignored advice, who pushed forward anyway, and why. Momentum builds as social response enters the frame, because social sentiment does not lie. It aggregates reactions in real time, and when analysis shows that audiences were responding negatively to specific promotional choices, that data becomes impossible to dismiss. And what holds attention here is the realization that warnings existed, feedback existed, and opportunities to adjust existed, yet the course remained unchanged. And that persistence suggests intent or confidence or miscalculation. And viewers stay engaged because they want to understand which one it was, and whether ego, strategy, or misreading the audience played the biggest role. Then the focus returns to narrative control, because as criticism grows, so does the effort to redirect it. And this is where media engagement becomes crucial, because when stories are challenged, reframed, or softened through selective sourcing, it reveals an attempt to steer conversation, and the audience recognizes this instinctively because they have seen it before. And what makes this instance compelling is how well documented it is, through messages, testimony, and timelines. And when attempts to balance or suppress stories are acknowledged, even partially, it undermines claims of transparency and reinforces the idea that perception management was a priority. And that realization keeps viewers watching, because it confirms that what they are seeing is not accidental but orchestrated. By this point, the audience understands that the conflict is not about one accusation or one disagreement, but about control over narrative authority. And once that becomes clear, every action is reinterpreted through that lens. Statements become strategy, silence becomes positioning, and timing becomes everything. And that sustained ambiguity is what drives retention, because the viewer is no longer passively consuming information. They are actively connecting dots, weighing credibility, and anticipating what will surface next. And as this section closes, the unresolved tension remains, because the more control that is revealed, the harder it becomes to reconcile later claims of powerlessness, and that unresolved contradiction is the hook that carries the audience forward, because once they see the pattern, they want to see how far it extends and who else is implicated by proximity, silence, or participation. And that curiosity is what ensures they stay until the end. As the narrative advances, the audience begins to recognize that the real story is not located in any single message or document, but in the accumulation of choices and the consistency of behavior over time. Because once the internal communications, public positioning, and professional submissions are viewed together, they form a mosaic that is difficult to dismiss. And what keeps viewers locked in is watching how every new detail does not stand alone but reinforces what came before. Because when authority is claimed repeatedly in professional settings and influences exercised repeatedly in private conversations, it establishes a pattern, and patterns matter because they reveal intent even when individual actions are explained away. And this is where the suspense intensifies, because the audience realizes that even if every single action is framed as justified, the overall trajectory still points in one direction, which is consolidation of control. The tension sharpens when attention turns to how information moved, because narratives do not spread on their own. They travel through people, channels, and incentives, and when messages suggest coordination between representatives, industry figures, and media contacts, it reveals how stories are shaped before the public ever sees them. And the reason this holds attention is because viewers are increasingly media literate. They understand how soft influence works, and when they see evidence of proactive engagement, they begin to question the authenticity of what they were shown, and that skepticism fuels continued viewing, because the audience wants to see whether the narrative can withstand scrutiny or whether it collapses under its own contradictions. What further deepens engagement is the introduction of timing, because timing transforms coincidence into strategy, and when communications align closely with emerging backlash, criticism, or shifts in public sentiment, it suggests responsiveness, not innocence. And viewers instinctively track these sequences because they want to know whether actions were taken before or after consequences appeared. And as each timestamp aligns with a new development, the story gains momentum because it feels less like chaos and more like choreography. And that realization is unsettling because it challenges the idea that events simply unfolded organically. The narrative becomes even more compelling when the emotional framing is examined, because language matters, and the way individuals describe themselves, others, and the situation reveals underlying positioning. And when language oscillates between empowerment and vulnerability depending on context, it signals adaptability but also inconsistency, and viewers pick up on that because they sense when rhetoric is tailored for outcome rather than truth, and that perception keeps them watching because they want to see whether the rhetoric stabilizes or continues to shift as pressure increases. Then comes the moment where the audience recognizes that silence can be as telling as speech, because when certain voices retreat at critical moments, it raises questions about exposure, risk, and strategic withdrawal. And this is where suspense peaks, because absence invites speculation, and speculation drives engagement. And as more parties appear to distance themselves publicly while remaining connected privately, the audience feels the gravity of what is unfolding, because they understand that reputational risk is being managed, not eliminated, and that subtle distinction matters. By now, the viewer is fully invested because they understand that this story operates on multiple levels simultaneously: personal, professional, and reputational, and each level feeds the others. And what keeps them watching is not outrage but curiosity, because they want to know whether accountability will ever match authority, and whether the narrative that secured recognition can coexist with the narrative that seeks protection. And as this section closes, the unresolved question remains hanging, because the more control that is documented, the harder it becomes to argue lack of agency. And that unresolved imbalance is the engine driving the story forward, ensuring the audience stays engaged, waiting for the moment when these parallel narratives finally collide. As the final layer of this section unfolds, the audience begins to understand that the most revealing element of this entire situation is not any single claim, but the cumulative effect of documentation, behavior, and response. Because when pressure intensified, the choices made by each party did not disperse confusion. They concentrated it, and that concentration is what keeps viewers watching, because clarity begins to emerge through repetition and consistency. And what becomes increasingly clear is that narrative defense required ongoing effort rather than simple explanation. And ongoing effort suggests something at stake beyond misunderstanding, because when people are confident in a single version of events, they do not need to continuously reinforce it across different audiences and platforms. And that realization is what anchors the viewer attention, because it reframes every action as part of a broader campaign of positioning rather than isolated reaction. The suspense deepens further when the audience recognizes how professional incentives intersect with personal alliances, because recognition, credit, and reputation all function as currency in this environment, and when those currencies are pursued simultaneously, the risk of contradiction increases and viewers instinctively sense when motivations overlap, because it creates pressure points where narratives strain and begin to show cracks, and this is where engagement peaks, because the viewer is now tracking not just what is said but why it is said and who benefits from each framing. And once that analytical lens is activated, the story becomes interactive rather than passive. And that interactivity is what keeps viewers from skipping ahead. Another critical element that sustains attention is the realization that accountability rarely announces itself, it arrives through comparison. And when professional submissions, statements, and private communications are compared side by side, the inconsistencies speak louder than any accusation, and that comparative process is compelling because it allows the audience to reach conclusions organically, rather than being told what to think. An organic realization is far more powerful for retention because it feels earned, and as the viewer connects these elements, they become invested in seeing whether the narrative ever resolves into coherence or remains fractured under scrutiny. The tension holds because resolution is delayed, and delayed resolution is a classic storytelling mechanism that works especially well in commentary because it mirrors real life outcomes where answers arrive slowly and unevenly, and as the audience sits with unanswered questions, they are motivated to continue watching because closure has been promised implicitly by the structure of the story, and every new detail feels like a step closer, even if the destination remains out of view. And that anticipation is what sustains engagement through long run times. As this section closes, the audience is left with a sharpened understanding that power, influence, and narrative are inseparable, and that when control is asserted in one space, it inevitably surfaces in others, and the inability to compartmentalize those assertions becomes the central tension, because credibility cannot be selectively applied, and once it is questioned in one context, it ripples outward, affecting all others, and that unresolved ripple is what propels the story forward, because viewers now understand that the conclusion is not about winning or losing, but about reconciliation of competing realities, and that reconciliation has not yet occurred, which ensures that attention remains fixed, waiting for the moment when documentation, perception, and accountability finally converge in the end. This ruling doesn't just close a door, it sends a warning through the entire courtroom and beyond. The judge made it clear that fishing expeditions, media pressure, and legal theatrics will not override the rules of evidence or due process. What happens next could reshape the balance of power in this case, and the fallout may be far bigger than anyone expected.